Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is afternoon, or just about. Welcome to today's conference on ISRT, Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance, and Targeting. It is part of a series conducted by Hudson Institute Center for American Sea Power. I'm Seth Cropsey, Senior Fellow here at Hudson, and also Director of the Center for American Sea Power. I hope that you have the monograph that is the subject of our discussion today. And if you do not, I believe that we still have copies out at the front desk, so by all means, pick up a copy on your way out. We're very fortunate to have with us today Brian McGrath, this man, my friend, and co-author of the monograph, who is also a retired naval officer, formerly deputy director of Hudson Center for American Sea Power, a prolific writer, and also managing director of the Ferrybridge Group, which is a national security and defense consultancy. It's also a pleasure to welcome David Larder, this man, also a retired naval officer and Defense News' best writer. I will offer some thoughts based on our monograph. Brian will follow. Then the three of us will discuss. We will conclude with questions and probably some answers. To the untrained eye, modern military technology may seem to have eliminated the fog of war that defined pre-modern battlefields. Victory in historic conflicts relied on the coincidence of skill and luck. The great commander sought to place himself in a position to impose his will on a chaotic battlefield in a single moment of genius, or a series of moments of genius. Nevertheless, reaching that moment required good fortune and the alignment of factors that were beyond his control. Intelligence traveled only as fast as a man could run, or a horse could ride, or a pigeon could fly. Victory, therefore, required months, if not years, of careful planning. Despite technological advancements, confusion and imprecision still defined the titanic clashes of the 20th century's wars. The U.S. fleet at Midway could only strike Japan's carriers as fast as its dive and torpedo bombers would fly. Luck proved instrumental. Commander McCluskey's decision to continue searching for Japan's carrier force and the American strike group's arrival just as the Japanese air wings were refueling and rearming played a large role in deciding the issue. Today, however, missiles and jets fly at hundreds of miles per hour, or in the case of hypersonic weapons, at over 100 miles in 2 minutes. Satellites circle the globe, advanced radars track dozens of targets, in the case of the Aegis combat system, hundreds. And laser-guided weapons are accurate to within feet, or sometimes inches. It's tempting to believe that conflict is now mechanical, that any enemy can be found and destroyed without much trouble, that the key to victory is simply building faster and longer range munitions. Munitions and delivery systems, whether aircraft, ships, submarines, or land-based launchers, are integral to victory. But it is a mistake to think that finding the enemy is any easier than before, and more specifically, that the modern U.S. military can locate and destroy adversaries at will. Contemporary U.S. intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting is under-equipped for the demands of great power competition, particularly in the Western Pacific. Without serious investment in overhaul, the U.S. risks being outpaced in peacetime and defeated in war. American sailors face the same difficulty as Ernest Hemingway's aging fisherman. The sea is big and old. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is responsible for 30 million square miles of open ocean in the Western Pacific alone. Several island chains break up this vastness, while civilian ships and aircraft sail and fly between some of the world's most populous nations. Moreover, the U.S. Pacific forces, alongside their regional allies, face the greatest threat to peace and order since the Soviet Union. The People's Republic of China has spent the past 40 years increasing its material wealth, and the last 20 undermining the US-backed global economic order, trying to substitute their own. Over the past decade, it has transformed its military from a force only suited to internal security missions to one that can project power abroad. The Chinese have developed a military designed to counter American and allied capabilities. It relies on maritime transport in a region defined by strategic choke points. Any large-scale economic disruptions could spark protests and threaten the regime's survival. Thus, any conflict China fights must be short, intense, decisive. General Secretary Xi Jinping does not fear conflict. He worries about a prolonged confrontation with the US and its allies. Thus, the People's Liberation Army possesses capabilities that will destroy a local adversary's military, while also forcing the US and Japan to choose between risking high-value assets like aircraft carriers or risking Taiwan cession to China. Deterring Chinese ambitions requires a mix of American and allied capabilities. However, the US military must field a very specific set of tools. It needs long-range standoff weapons that can penetrate Chinese air defenses, strike aircraft to carry them, range extenders to enable strikes while keeping carriers secure, air superiority fighters to defend high-value targets, subsurface capabilities to infiltrate China's denial network, and surface combatants for air, defense, strike, and command and control. These assets have diminished value without enough intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting. China will deploy its missiles on aircraft, ships, submarines, and land-based launchers. These are relatively small and, in most cases, highly mobile targets that will be difficult to detect. The US must be able to identify these targets efficiently and at range. That is, there must be enough space between forward-positioned US surveillance tools and major fleet formations or long-range bombers to keep the latter out of harm's way. Otherwise, the US must choose between deploying carriers within strike range of China's long-range missiles, thereby exposing them to risks not run since the Second World War, or backing out of strike range and allowing China to execute the opening stages of its plans unimpeded. Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting is of equal importance before conflict. Chinese geography gives it strategic advantages, particularly in a confrontation over Taiwan. While the US must rely on supply and communication lines spanning the Pacific Ocean and will only have immediate access to regional reinforcements, China can concentrate forces and pour in reserves much more quickly. Nevertheless, China cannot strike from a standing start. It must concentrate air and ground forces across the Taiwan Strait, increase naval presence, and prepare for a surge to disable Taiwanese defenses while warding off a U.S. and allied response. With enough warning, the U.S. can increase the costs of a Chinese offensive. Even 2 forward-deployed attack submarines plus a surge in aircraft from Japan and Pacific carrier groups could make a real difference. But obtaining this early warning requires long-term surveillance. The U.S. needs ISRT feedback if it hopes to shape the Pacific battlefield and execute its strategy of deterrence by denial. Specifically, it needs constant information on assets and positions within 200 miles of the Chinese coastline, along with eyes on China's coastal garrisons, air bases, and ports in the Eastern Military District. Important to note that similar thinking applies to Chinese forces in the South China Sea. The U.S. requires constant surveillance of the PLA Navy's South Seas fleet ships and accompanying aircraft or amphibious units moving from ports in southern China toward both the disputed islands and Malacca and Lombok Straits. China itself has recognized the importance of ISRT. Even until a decade ago, China's military remained largely backward. It lacked centralized funding. It did not rigorously simulate combat situations. Most of its fighter pilots did not fly at night. The PLA primarily conducted territorial defense and internal security missions. Still, China has steadily developed its anti-satellite capabilities since the 1980s, staging a series of public tests from 2007 to 2018, and incorporating its anti-satellite capabilities research into its space program. Satellite capabilities are critical to the US's ISRT complex. Not only do they provide valuable pre-conflict intelligence, they also serve as critical communication nodes between US forces in multiple theaters. The Chinese ASAT strike would disrupt US operations globally while undermining American ISRT, specifically in the Western Pacific. Currently, the US lacks ISRT capabilities with the range and staying power needed properly to monitor Chinese movements. This impedes the United States' ability to deter conflict, to shape the battlefield, and in the end, to win a war. Open source analyses cannot undertake the detailed technical examination of their classified counterparts. Still, US maritime ISRT has become so hollowed out that the lack of coordination and development is evident. US ISRT is comprised of aircraft, surface and subsurface sensors, and land-based sensors equipped with radio frequency, light-based, electromagnetic, and sound-ranging tools. But neither the Navy nor the Department of Defense have made enough effort to centralize the procurement, deployment, and assessment of ISRT architecture infrastructure. Thus, I think it's fair to say that no one really knows what the Navy's ISRT requirements in the Western Pacific actually are. By extension, no one really knows how current ISRT capabilities actually relate to quantifiable US requirements. I'm not making a new observation here, but a fleet without eyes cannot fight. Several policy steps should be taken to overhaul the US's Western Pacific ISRT. For one, The Navy should attempt to define the problem. Congress should provide funding for the Navy to conduct a detailed classified study of Pacific ISRT capabilities and requirements. This would allow Navy to develop targeted quick fix responses to capability gaps as it would properly plan future acquisitions. Indeed, I think that all U.S. armed services in every major theater should conduct a similar review. Certain stopgap measures can boost current capability shortfalls. The Navy's acquisition of MQ-4C Triton UAVs will boost ISRT capabilities by providing commanders with a high endurance, long loiter time information collection platform. But full operational capability isn't expected until 2023. In the interim, the Defense Department could retask U.S. Air Force MQ-9 Reaper UAVs from Central Command and deploy them to the Pacific in a similar role to the MQ-4C. Those who answer or might object that we should not impoverish one strategic theater to benefit another are right. Both CENTCOM and INDOPACOM are essential U.S. interests. Funding ought to reflect this. The Navy should also consider increasing its projected MQ-4C fleet, a feasible proposition, since the MQ-4C program has only just reached initial operational capability. In the medium term, the Navy should modify the MQ-5 Stingray to serve as an unmanned ISRT platform. Converting the U-class, that's Unmanned Carrier Launch Surveillance and Strike program, to the CBARS, that is the carrier-based aerial refueling system, was an intelligent organizational choice. The Navy has lacked a carrier air wing organic range extender since the early 2000s. Since the retirement of the A6 and F-14, carrier air wing strike has shrunk. Any strategy employing standoff strikes will require an aircraft that fills the MQ-25's role. By expanding its mission profile to include ISRT would both increase U.S. Navy capabilities and, I believe, avoid extreme costs. Designers could emphasize long-range sensors rather than stealth or speed, thereby avoiding the difficulties that the U-class program encountered. An ironic characteristic of strategy, and I will close my remarks here, is its cyclical nature. Tactical and operational methods thought to be obsolete are revived with new technologies or strategies to the same deadly effect as before their initial decline. Think about the scout plane concept that fell out of practice with the decline of dreadnought battleships. The Navy should consider reviving this concept, developing a medium altitude, long endurance UAV like the MQ-4C or MQ-9 that can be deployed and recovered by U.S. surface combatants. This would increase U.S. ISRT coverage while also making the use of hypersonic weapons and railguns by surface combatants more feasible. These spotter UAVs could direct munitions toward their targets while the destroyer or cruiser launching the missile, or whatever launching the missile, would remain out of strike range. The U.S. must also coordinate redundant and independent capability developments with its regional allies, particularly Japan. The Japan self-defense forces are sophisticated, they're highly competent. But the ground force still receives most of the funding, while air and maritime forces have not developed robust ISRT capabilities or assets that would survive a massive Chinese strike. The suggestions of Hudson's ISRT report apply equally to the defense of Japan, and I'll leave it at that for the time being. Brian, the podium is yours.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some friendly faces in the audience. I'm not sure you all understand just how fortunate you are today to be here, because you get to see David Larder with his hair combed, his beard trimmed, and in a suit and tie. And that's like a unicorn sighting here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for the invitation, Seth. It's good to be here. And I also want to thank the third silent member of the writing team, a gentleman named Harrison Schramm, who happens to be one of the most deeply insightful operations analysts that I know. And he did all the math, because Seth and I don't do math. Why did we do this study? What caused it? Someone just asked me that the other day. Actually, somebody in the Navy just asked me that the other day. A couple of things. Number one, there was a 2018 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that directed the Navy to do something like this, to do a study of its ISR&T sufficiency. Specifically, one of the things that they asked for was that the study include operations in a satellite-denied environment, which I thought was interesting. So to me, it seemed that if the Congress were asking the Navy to do such a study, smart people in the Congress were worried that there wasn't work being done. And so we watched. Seth and I remember communicating when that language came out in the NDAA, and we watched. And we didn't see much coming out into the press. We didn't see much attention being given to it, so we decided we would give some attention to it. Another reason to do this study was the national security strategy that came out in the early months, I think it was January 2018, had a very big idea in it. And that very big idea was that the United States posture for conventional deterrence would move from that of deterrence by punishment to deterrence by denial. These are very different ways of attempting to deter conventionally. In the one, the aggressor attains some level of success in their objectives, and that the threat of being pounded into submission by the cavalry coming over the horizon is thought to be enough to dissuade them. The other is deterrence by denial, in which forces that are present are sufficiently lethal and capable to keep the opponent from the aggression in the first place. Because when you look at the geography of the region that we're looking at in the Western Pacific, because there are so many possible targets of aggression so close to the Chinese mainland, where so much force could be marshaled in so little time, this decision by the Trump administration to change the nation's conventional deterrence posture, I think, was a very, very smart one. But it levies requirements. The force that's in the neighborhood has to be better. It has to be stronger. It has to have more weapons, and it has to have more ISR, and it has to have more networks that link all that together. There is a missile ISR mismatch in the Navy right now. In the January 2015 issue of Proceedings, the three admirals in charge of the Navy's surface force, then Vice Admiral Roden, Rear Admiral Fanta, and Rear Admiral Gumatau, wrote an article where they put forward this idea of distributed lethality. And in this article, under the section where they were suggesting some things that they needed to operationalize this concept, they write, persistent organic airborne intelligence, surveillance, ISR, and data relay is something that they need. Quote, an important aspect of distributed lethality is the ability to confidently conduct dispersed operations apart from centralized command and control networks. Local combat information networks are essential to achieving localized battle space awareness. Those networks need to be more capable than those existing today. They must be persistent in a satellite-denied or jamming-intensive environment. Whether current vertical takeoff unmanned aerial systems have the persistence necessary to support dispersed offensive operations remains to be seen. By that, they meant shipboard helicopters. But the potential for them to augment networking and information sharing should be examined. The ability of hunter-killer surface action groups to launch and recover fixed-wing or partially fixed-wing UAVs will be pivotal to employing UAVs in this role. I mention this specifically because it was evident from that article almost 5 years ago that the three guys in charge of surface warfare in the Navy believed there was an ISR problem. They believed it enough to put it in proceedings and make sure everybody read it. As a young man, I did a lot of cruise missile certifications when I was on active duty. You'd have this bunch of experts from the shore support organizations would come on board, and in 2 days of very intense simulation, determine the degree to which you were able to employ surface-to-surface weapons. We used to have a weapon called a TASM, a Tomahawk anti-ship missile. The TASM had a range of about 250 miles. And I remember going through these certifications, discussing the employment of this weapon, both with the teams and then when we would sit around on our ship, if we, thinking about what would happen if we ever got TASM. The bottom line was the weapon's range greatly outstripped our ability to understand what we were targeting. And because once it was a fire and forget weapon, the area of uncertainty of the target grew as this subsonic weapon moved downrange. We got rid of TASM for many reasons, some of it associated with arms control treaties. But I think one of the reasons that the Navy didn't fight harder to keep it was very difficult to employ. We just didn't have the situational awareness, the ISR&T, to match the range. Well, now I'm looking at a Navy that has Tomahawk Block 4, Maritime Strike Tomahawk, with ranges at nearly 1,000 miles. Looking at the SM-6 in a surface-to-surface mode with unclassified discussions of ranges over 200 miles. I mean, we have spent the money we need to get the weapons we need out there. The question in my mind was, do we have the ISR to support those weapons? And my gut feeling was no, and I convinced Seth that that was a no, and that we wanted to get after this. And so we got Harrison Schramm, and we started to think about it. Some of the things we thought about. I'm a former destroyer captain. I have relationships with lots of destroyer captains today, folks who have sailed through the South China Sea. You talk to them, you talk to anyone who operates in the Western Pacific today, they will tell you, yes, we believe the Chinese have us targeted. It's just a cost of doing business, that they believe all the time that some element of the People's Liberation Army has them targeted. My supposition in starting this thing was, why can't we create that same sense of certainty in the Chinese destroyer and frigate captains? Why can't we make them understand that they are always targeted, 24/7, 365, in peacetime? Someone knows exactly where you are, and there are enough weapons of sufficient capability and range in the theater to ensure that every single Chinese surface ship over 100 meters long has weapons associated with it. That was the sort of the operational imperative that we looked at. This is 1.66 million square miles of water inside the first island chain. This is a hard problem. Currently, I know of no such operational imperative that naval forces are operating under in the Western Pacific. Were they to be operating under that imperative, my understanding of the capability of the systems, their ranges and their sensitivity, leads me to believe that there is no way they could pull it off today. There is a lot of discussion in these circles about national technical means or overhead assets or satellites. The minute you get into those discussions, you go to a classification level that greatly exceeds this room. But the second thing is I want to go back to the congressional guidance or the congressional direction in the NDAA, which was to report also in a satellite-denied environment. And so in order to bound our study, we decided that we would not deal with national technical means. We would just assume either that they were under the control of elements other than the three-star sort of operational commanders in the Navy who would have the ability to task those systems, or that they would be gone, or that they would be doing other things. So we took them out of the analysis. You may quibble with that, and we can talk about that if you like, but I want to make sure you understand that it was one of our bounding assumptions. We focused on unmanned systems in this. The Navy has a program of record to buy 70 MQ-4C Tritons, 68 operational models and two early models. I'm not sure exactly what they're calling them. Those 68 aircraft are purchased over the course of the lifetime of this acquisition program. The operational requirement is for 5 orbits, which is the way we describe how ISR of this size deploys. 5 orbits of 4 planes apiece, 20 airplanes worldwide. 20 airplanes worldwide. And we started to think, okay, that's the Navy's major ISR platform to fill this targeting requirement or this targeting problem. Could they pull off this 365-day-a-year, 24/7 targeting problem inside the first island chain? We assume no friendly or allied contributions to this. That's probably not reasonable. We will likely have some friends and allies helping us locate aggressor surface platforms. But for the purposes of our inquiry, we wanted to focus on our ability to support an operational requirement that we think is useful. We assume a representative level of surface ship density and posture for both the United States and China during peacetime. Peacetime, remember that. We're looking to bolster the conventional deterrence by denial of the United States Navy. And we do that by putting more and more powerful forces forward that are supplied by a sufficient ISR&T, so that the other guy always knows that when he or she is underway, that someone is watching. That's what we're trying to do. We assume that the United States continues its commitments in Europe and elsewhere. And we assume that the U.S. has ongoing maritime surveillance requirements in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Gulf region. We're not concerned with weapons, with the performance of weapons in this analysis, okay? I invite you to take a good dive into the monograph that we provided. There are a number of graphs and charts and tables that describe the operational challenges associated with attempting to just do what Harrison, our OA guy, referred to as mow the grass. That is, if you wish to take a airborne radar operating at 50,000 feet that has about a 287-mile area of concern, if you want to look at 1.66 million square miles every 12 hours, and that's just one time covering every one of those 1.66 million square miles, you need 5 MQ-4s in the air at one time, just to mow the grass. Mowing the grass is insufficient when you want to maintain target on targets of opportunity, because as you mow, you're going to hit somebody, and you're going to say, hey, that's somebody we want to stay on. Staying on that target requires persistence, which takes away from your ability to continue to mow the grass. There's a distinction between focused search and area search, and we go into that in the discussion. We talk in our monograph about what the time to get to station does to the ability of airplanes, and how many airplanes you need, and how it adds to the number of airplanes. We looked at Guam specifically. We looked at Guam. I think I remember Guam was something along the order of 2,000 miles from the center of the South China Sea. So an MQ-4 would have to fly from Guam 2,000 miles to get to the middle. That's 4,000 miles. That's a lot of fuel. That's a lot of on-station time. Bottom line here is, if we are going to maintain a 24/7, 365 target environment to the fidelity that I think we need there, the current buy of MQ-4Cs is not going to get us there. It's not going to get us close to there. So we then decided, when we show this with our, what Harrison calls pilot math. Now, the pilot math has a couple of assumptions in it, which is there are no false targets. You're getting every bit of the horizon limited radar range. There's no weather problems. I mean, this is the very best possible case for radar surveillance of these waters. Now, there are obviously other ways to survey those waters, but radar surveillance helps in a very important way. So what we did was back of the envelope pilot math that led us to believe that the MQ-4C buy is incredibly insufficient. In fact, if we devoted all 20 airplanes to the Pacific, all 20 operational airplanes to the Pacific theater, we would have a difficult time meeting the objective of covering the Chinese surface vessels. So we, as Seth described, we made a few recommendations. I'd like to drill down into a couple of those, if I could, in my remaining time. The first is, I'd like to see the organization tasked to do this research be an FFRDC, a federally funded research and development corporation, that has the clearance, the facility clearance necessary to really get at a merged ISR environment that brings in the satellite, brings in performance characteristics of the sensors that are in the region, that are on the airplanes, to give a better view. I want someone other than the Navy to do this. I'd like the Navy participating, but I'd like some outside organization to report on this. I want to bring your attention to an interesting, we talk about two particular kinds of medium altitude, long endurance UAVs. The Navy had an idea, it mostly existed at the Office of Naval Research. It was called TERN, T-E-R-N. It was a tail-sitter kind of aircraft that had long on-station time, a variety of podded sensor packages that dramatically would increase the ISR capability of dispersed surface forces. The Marine Corps currently is working on a program called MUX. I believe it means the Marine Corps Unmanned Expeditionary Capability. And if you go and do the research, and I think we provide the links in the report, you go and look at what the Marine Corps is asking for from MUX. I remember reading the industry day brief that they provided and thinking, oh my God, this is what I want for the surface force. Because if you look at the mission sets, it is a virtual overlap. The Marine Corps has lots of different ways to get at their requirement. A ship-based one could be the answer. Land-based ones could be the answer. They're looking into which would work best for them. But they're putting real money against trying to fulfill this set of emerging requirements for ISR to support Marine Corps operations and to support the Commandant's new vision of naval integration. I think we need to buy more MQ-4s. We need to buy them faster. I think we need to spend some money on taking some of these MQ-9 Reapers, and there is a maritime version of the MQ-9 Reaper. We need to turn some of them into maritime assets. Somebody asked me recently, well, who should the Navy operate them or the Air Force operate? I don't care. I really don't care. I do care that we get more of these assets, more assets into the theater that can help. Before I step off and turn this over to David Larder, I recognize that what I'm talking about here is just the first several steps of a kill chain. I haven't really spent time on the weapons. I haven't really spent time on the networking. Those are important, and if you want to get into them, we can talk about that a little. But that ends my presentation. I hope you enjoy the report, and I look forward to David's questions.
Well, I thank Brian and Seth for the opportunity to hang out here today and ask a few questions. It's a very interesting report. I had a couple questions right off the top of the bat. First of all, one of the assets you left out of the report was the P-8 fleet, and I'm wondering what contribution you see the P-8s making to the ISR capabilities in the Western Pacific.
One of the constraints that we put on ourselves was that we would deal with unmanned assets. One of the reasons was because manned assets have other missions, especially the P-8. If we were in a time of increasing tension or in a time where we were really serious about ISR of undersea assets, the Chinese submarine fleet, our understanding would be that the P-8 fleet would be very, very busy with the submarine threat and would be less of a factor in looking for surface contacts.
And there's also an issue of the cost of P-8 and what threats it faces running around in that area, vice the cost of a reduced UAV. By the way, if somebody is brave enough and doesn't understand the acronyms that we're using here, I would be obliged if you'd just raise your hand and then we'll say what it is. In any case, there's a cost issue there and a numbers issue there, and the P-8 would have a difficulty, especially with Chinese surface-to-air capabilities as they are now and as they're projected to be in the future.
So you discussed some of the threats that they're facing. I believe the Global Hawk that was shot down by Iran was about $180 million. And I hate to be the guy that brings up cost, but the discussion afterwards was there was some reporting, I believe, in Foreign Policy that that really freaked out DoD that they lost their $180 million drone to an Iranian missile, a missile that was built in Iran. And there was some discussion of just canceling the whole program. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. But what would you say to people that say, well, we're spending too much money on exquisite ISR assets that are too vulnerable? What would be the response? And how?
Well, it's certainly an issue, but it's not as though there are no alternatives that are lower cost. And those alternatives are mentioned in our report. So, yeah, it's a lot of money to lose in a drone, but fortunately, it's not the only UAV with those capabilities. It does have extended range and so forth, but it's not the only game in town.
I think there's sort of two big ideas bound up in this question. One is, again, gets us back to conventional deterrence. If your view or if your desire is to maintain a conventional deterrence posture, what you are aiming at is to keep that first shot from happening, right? And so you will spend money on more exquisite technology in order to provide you that confidence that you, if the other guy then is not deterred, which everybody calls it a failure of deterrence, but deterrence is always matched to a certain level of will or desire on the other side. And if the other side's will or desire exceeds your conventional deterrent posture, they're going to shoot. Then we start to talk about the shooting war and the things that are important within the shooting war. I think that once we get into a sort of general war or a hot environment, the discussion of cheap and many and fast and swarming and all of those concepts that are important war-fighting concepts come into play. They're just less important before the shooting starts. Before the shooting starts, these more exquisite technologies, I think, are useful. One more thing. I think we have to really think deeply about how unmanned systems lower the bar for conflict. The Iranians believed that they could take a shot at an MQ-4 and that they would probably get away with it. Lo and behold, they got away with it. Because we did not consider the loss of an MQ-4 a war-inducing. So the question is everybody just going to start to believe that the unmanned vehicles of everyone else are fair game? And that's just kind of a restive piece. It's a cost of doing business. I don't know, but we got to think about that.
Well, the DOD, whoever we're talking about at DOD, had good reason to be freaked out, but I think that the better reason to be freaked out was not that the drone had been lost, but that there was no response afterwards, because when Brian was talking about deterrence, if you want to deter that from happening again, then you have to make it clear that there's a cost for doing it. And that cost does not necessarily mean going to war. I mean, we've used force many, many times, most of the time, without going to war.
This actually sets up an interesting dynamic, right? If you have two opposing forces in a constrained area, like us and the Chinese potentially, and we both have created these ISR environments in peacetime that enable each other to know where the others are all the time, then the destruction of an ISR asset is different than other potential aggressive acts, right? Because at that point, you have to ask yourself, is the opposing force trying to poke my eyes out before they do something bigger and more aggressive? So there is a potential for, I referred to this in a meeting once as a conventional balance of terror in ISR, in a region where ISR helps provide stability, some sort of conventional stability to a region.
You know, one of the things that you could get into if you were, say, a requirements person in the Pentagon would be, well, if they can see my Global Hawk or Triton, maybe we should go even further towards maybe a low observable ISR asset, which of course is going to drive costs. And what you're talking about is a volume business when you're talking about the Pacific. How do you sort of guard against very DoD-like drives to not be seen and put the most exquisite thing up in the air versus your need for just a lot of coverage?
We need some of both. I mean, we need volume, and then we need some low signature, more exquisite stuff to do the really serious missions where you may not want the other guy to know that you're doing it.
So I found one of the really interesting things I found was the organic ISR T from surface combatants. My background is on surface ships as well. One of my areas where I was always uncomfortable was the idea of targeting the Harpoon missile meant that you would send the helicopter over the horizon, and if you are sending it against a relatively capable surface combatant, there's really nothing from them shooting down the helicopter, and then of course you're risking the pilot's lives. The unmanned ISRT asset from a surface combatant then seems to solve that problem, but you also run into the problem now of saying to your friends in naval aviation, hey, so we need a drone that puts you out of business. To a certain extent, not completely out of business. But I'm wondering, you know, this ConOps that's coming together, this distributed ConOps, and it seems like it's going to need some teams working together. And I'm wondering if you believe the Navy is set up to create the kind of ISR coverage that you're looking for, and especially the sort of organic from surface ships, because you're going to have to go through aviation for that. It was a long preamble, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm a consultant. I consult to the Navy. So you have to all take that, put it away, because what I'm going to tell you now are my opinions, not what I get paid to do. My opinion here is that this is a very thorny bureaucratic problem. We allude to that in the report. In the first draft of it, I did a hell of a lot more than allude to it. I took it on pretty strongly, and then I backed the language out. Surface people like Dave and me believe we need more organic ISR. We need that. We need something that takes off from my ship, is under my control, completes my fire control loop. Anything that takes off from my deck is paid for by airplane guys in the Navy. And the airplane guys have quite justifiably said for years, you don't have a requirement for that. You haven't showed us your requirement. And this part of this is a function of the missiles moving out in capability faster than the ISR could catch up to it. This is why I think the Congress asked the Navy to do its study, was to determine whether or not such a requirement exists. The Marines clearly believe such a requirement exists because they have begun to move forward with this much
List. and not a ton of resources with which to execute that. And I'm wondering, how do you make the case for what would be, spending on a lot of extra ISR, what you'd say would be essential ISR capabilities, and balancing against the political promises and the things that the Navy wants to do, to what it said it needs to do and what it says it's required to do under its mandates to fulfill our national security obligations.
Well, it's a really good question, because the increases that the administration has proposed and have been agreed to by Congress over the past few years are going to turn around 2 years from now. And so we're going to start seeing decreases in the defense budget, beginning with 1.8%. And as difficult as it is to reach the 355 ship goal in 30 plus years, it's going to be more difficult with the budget on the decline. So I'm afraid I don't have an innovative or creative or imaginative answer to your good question. I just have a very simple one, and that is that if the American people and their representatives want to be safe and want to understand what threat is materializing in the West Pacific and is likely to continue materializing in the future, you have to spend the money.
Was a lot of meat here. Ship counts are an unsatisfying way of qualifying a Navy. They work for two things. Number one, they work in comparing your gross size to other navies of the world's gross size. And they work in comparison to previous U.S. navies. There must be a better way of qualifying or quantifying a Navy's power. I just don't know what it is. Acting Secretary Modly has made it very clear what he wants of his uniforms, and that is, give me a 355. How do we get to 355 within 10 years? The National Security Advisor, as David said, made it very clear that that's an administration goal. If we continue to count ships the way we do today, 292 ships today, I believe, 355 ships is almost 22% larger. It's about $40 billion more a year to maintain a Navy of that size above. You can't just buy the ships. You have to maintain them. You have to put people in them. You have to buy weapons for them. You have to send food to them. You have to give them fuel, grease, parts, training. All of those things. The tail associated with a 21.7% increase in the size of a Navy is gigantic. I would not want to be one of those uniformed 4 stars in the Navy or 3 stars who has to try to figure out how to send the acting secretary a shipbuilding plan that gets you to 355 if we count the same way we do today. We ignore smaller ships. We ignore MQ-4s. MQ-4s are important. P-8s are important in this networked naval force. We don't plan to count large unmanned surface vessels. These are planned to have 32 missiles on them apiece, or at least 32 missiles on them. We're not counting these things as part of the Navy. We didn't count coastal patrol boats in our ship counts before. Secretary Mabus tried during his time to increase the Navy ship count by counting stuff that wasn't being counted, and he got pounded by the Hill on it. I think Secretary Motley would be well advised to bring the Hill, the Joint Staff, OSD, and the Navy uniforms together, go out to Airlie or some conference center for a weekend and throw 75 pizzas in a room and say, come out with a new way to count that you all sign up with. Because if the goal is to get to 355 as we currently count, it's a pipe dream. Because there ain't $40 billion additional dollars a year for the Navy unless, number one, a giant defense increase that funds all the services larger happens, which is the way we generally do it. Or number two, a serious strategic choice is made to privilege sea power over other elements of military power. I don't see that happening.
Well, that goes back to Goldwater Nichols. Well, the United States in the past has made strategic decisions to underfund, to defund one service, the Army, and to upfund, raise funds for another service, strategic rocket forces, during the Eisenhower administration, because Eisenhower said, hey, this is cheaper, and and what's more, it's needed to compete. So it's not as though that has never been done, but in the current political climate, it's extremely difficult. And I agree with Brian that simple ship numbers are not a foolproof expression of power. But I'm searching for a better one, and I also agree without any question that that simply counting the legacy ships that we have right now as ones that will be included in whatever number is decided on has limitations and faults, and that we should be looking at, if we make as much of a move towards unmanned vehicles on the surface as well as in the air and below the surface, those should absolutely be counted at the same time.
We're going to build extra large diameter unmanned surface vessels. Those are diesel submarines. They're diesel submarines without people in them. But we're not going to count them? Why would we not count those? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. So I think the acting secretary needs to maybe change the frame of reference as he pursues the number.
I have one more question before I'll turn it over to the audience, and because I'm a hopeless nerd about wargaming and things like that, I'm interested. You mentioned in your report about the Chinese. The Chinese essentially, the assumption being that China can see all of our ships within a certain area of the Western Pacific. Based on what you know, and obviously this is unclassified, but what's your sense on that? What is the extent and the reach of the Chinese ISR complex? Is that a safe assumption to say that they know? Because that also kind of limits, it is also limiting if they really could see everything we were doing and everywhere we were. So I'm wondering what your sense is on an unclassified about the Chinese ISR complex.
I think the technical term for the perception that the Chinese enjoy targeting ubiquity within the first island chain, I think the technical term is it's crap. Things like sunspots, things like weather patterns, things like maintenance on facilities, things like attrition, all kinds of things go into what the probability of detection is at any one point in the ocean from some other point on the globe. We tend to think, and people tend to think, that there's like this pizza wedge that goes out from China out to 1,000 miles, and it's sea floor to 100,000 feet, that if you're in there, they're going to find you, and they're going to That's just not the way it is. It's hard to do. It's really hard to do. Now, there are tools that are going to make things easier, but the concept that they have it all in there is just wrong. The concept that I have that we should be able to do the same thing within the first island chain is hard. It's hard. Weather gets in the way. Sea state gets in the way. Temperature, again, sunspot activity. All these things get in the way. Break. The other thing is we have to understand, if we're going to operate in that environment all the time, we have to understand from day to day, from hour to hour, where are the weak spots in that ISR complex, and operate near those weak spots and project power from those weak spots. But that is a technical challenge that I think the Navy's working on.
Yeah, but I want to return to something you said before, Brian, and that is the perception among our COs of their vulnerability. And I'm reminded of an old sawhorse in Navy. The question is, how many mines does it take to create a minefield? Right? And the answer, 0. If the ship's captain thinks there's a mine there, he's going to act accordingly. And I can tell you from participating in tabletop exercises beginning several years ago, that the perception of at least the naval officers playing the game was they can see us and they can target us. So I agree with Brian's
Technical
term, but when you see people actually doing things, at least in attempts to simulate the real world, it's a different story. Yeah, we intended to have time for questions, and so we'll open the floor to questions. And would you please identify yourself and your organization, if there is one, and would you also tell us to whom your question is directed? And also, last, would you ask your question in the form of a question? We'll start here and we'll move back. And please wait until you get the mic before.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I can pretty much promise you that the PRC has agents in every single port in the Western Pacific, just like in Pearl Harbor, and they know every single U.S. ship coming in and out. So at least that they can fix. Also, I'm wondering, is it okay to include the Coast Guard vessels? And that's the other question is, did you look at wide area surveillance drones at all? I think parking one of those in the stratosphere over Hainan Island would take care of a lot of our problems. Did you look at Gorgon Stair in any way?
All right, let's start with the Coast Guard. I do not believe the United States Coast Guard has a role in the South China Sea. Period. End of story. That's my view. It's not widely shared, but the Coast Guard doesn't have enough things to do the missions it has right now. And that when we assign them naval missions, we tell ourselves a false narrative that we're making it better. We're not. We're taking away from some other thing that the Coast Guard is uniquely constituted to do. Secondly, there are some interesting concepts about, like airships for surveillance. Some of the things that you're talking about, we didn't think about those. We didn't cover them specifically in our inquiry, in my view, mostly because they're not either programs of record or ideas that are seriously under consideration by the Navy right now. At least at the level that we understand of classification.
Other questions? Let's see. All right, there's one over here.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I'd like to come back to your topic, surveillance, naval surveillance, in the era of great power competition. And you have made it clear that the number of ships does not reflect the capability of our naval surveillance. And you made it clear that we don't have adequate money to fund the required 40 billions. My question is, in the view of using the whole government that recently put out, why don't we use the whole government ideas? And if you look at the budget, the DOD require 750 billions. The State Department, Foreign Affairs, only is allowed 40 billions, 1 year of making 20% of the ship's amount that you're talking about. And if we're talking about distance between Guam and the South China Sea, why not talk about the distance between the Subic Bay, Vietnam, Okinawa, Atu Aba with Taiwan to China? Is there a different calculus that we should look to and increase the capability of our Navy in surveillance? And not only that, to deter China. I am afraid when I heard the recent news that our Assistant Secretary Randall Schreiber just resigned because he's the top Pentagon Asia hand. And he resigned because what he proposed not being approved or not go through the bureaucracy. I trust that Hudson has direct consultation ideas to the current administration. Would you give some consultation to the budget, to the State Department, to the allies, and to our human resources in the Defense Department, in the State Departments, especially ASEAN? It's been stressed that in the Indo-Pacific strategy, ASEAN is at the heart of it. And our recent ADMM Plus and ADMMO, the EAS meeting, the US had no presence. Would that somehow undermine your work? Thank you.
Yeah, whole government approaches have been to the question of China, for example, have been discussed at high levels of government. For example, Vice President Pence advocated that from this platform last year. There's a sort of a gap between, a distance between saying this is something that we need to do and actually having it happen. But it's important to begin by saying this is needed. I'd like to say something about your point about the bases that we have in the West Pacific and from which we operate, at any rate. The proximity question that you point out is correct. There's no arguing with that geographically. But still those bases have to be supplied. And still those bases have to be defended. So, and that supply and that defense is something that we rely on allies for, but for example, with Guam, that's us. I mean, that's ours to supply and it's ours to defend. So there are still limitations, very sizable limitations on our ability, on logistics ability, from the bases in Japan from which we operate to Guam, the whole region.
Ma'am, I thank you for your question because it's a very smart one. And I don't want you to think that because you're sitting in a room with guys whose pasts were in the Department of Defense that we don't either value or prize what it is the State Department and the rest of the government does. We do. Our alliances in that region, as far as I'm concerned, are among the most important we have. Those alliances are tended on a daily basis by hardworking diplomats. I am confident that they continue to do their very best to carry forward the message that we're involved, we're engaged, we care, and that we have your back. Secretary Shriver, I think that's his name, the man you're, I don't know him. I understand from people I respect that he is one of the best. I want you to know that there are a lot of very good, very smart people continuing the work he was doing, or others who are ready to come back into government to help. They're there. They are there. And I don't think you're going to see a big change in our policy or in the effectiveness of our policy because of the loss of one person, no matter how good he or she is at their job. This whole of government thing is absolutely essential. It isn't just the Navy, it isn't just the military that is going to keep the peace in the Western Pacific. It is going to be making sure that our network of alliances, that I would not trade our friends for China's friends. Specifically, I'd like to be much more friendly with Vietnam, as a matter of fact. I wouldn't trade that, and I share your fear of that network diminishing. I don't know that I have much of a fear that it's going to happen. I think we'll be able to keep our friends. You're looking at the wrong guy to defend the personnel decisions of this administration. Understood. I think that's fair charge.
Yeah. We have a question toward the back of the room.
Good afternoon. Brian McDermott. I'm a retired Marine aviator, and currently I'm a strategic red team analyst for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, section formerly known as JIDO, Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization. First of all, thank you for the presentation. You already kind of answered one of my questions because I saw your recommendation mainly aviation focused. Didn't know if you had thought about using PTIDs, balloons, which are persistent tactical detection systems, like used over our bases in Iraq for early warning, and tethering those to like Sea Hunter surface vessels, though I'll defer to your expertise on naval surface vessel knowledge. So my other question is, keeping all the assumptions in place, one of your recommendations is increasing the program of record of MQ-4s. So I'm going to make the assumption that the Navy is not going to increase manpower, and I'd like to hear from both you gentlemen. So with no increase in people power, but you're asking for an increase in MQ-4 procurement, and potentially also altering MQ-25s. And I'll assume that's going to mean more technicians, more drone pilots, et cetera. What would you recommend to the Navy to reduce or cut? Thank you for your time.
To cut for what?
If you're making the assumption of increasing the program record for MQ-4s, which will mean more drone pilots, more maintainers, same thing for your MQ-25s, altering that, what would you recommend to the Navy to reduce or cut if there's no increase in overall people strength?
Okay, I'm going to let Seth answer that question specifically, and I'm going to answer it the way I want to. I am not in the business of advising the Navy or anyone else on how the Navy should make do with less money. I'm here to tell you that they don't get enough. They need more. They need to make a better case. and explain to the American people why it is that sea power is different and why these programs should be funded. Secondly, the UAVs and airships and those, the unmanned surface vessels and airships. Those are good ideas. Those are, I was trying to stay, I think we were trying in our analysis to stay more in programs of record and other things that have some institutional momentum that we're aware of. There may be others that are classified that we don't. You want to take the?
Yeah, sure. The last time I counted the civilians who work for central agencies under the Secretary, in OSD, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, in number, almost equaled the Marine Corps. I think that if we ought to bound that problem by looking at the number of people, their functions, and the necessity for keeping such a large force, I think that that would produce some significant savings that could be applied elsewhere where they're needed and more applicable to combat itself and certainly to deterrence.
Folks, we're either in a great power competition or we're not. And if we're going to try to fund a great power competition with post-Cold War and post-Cold War mentality, we're never going to get there. We're never going to compete. The American people are going to have to decide whether they're serious about this. America's leaders have not made the case effectively that we need to get serious about it.
We have a larger civilian bureaucratic workforce today than we did during the Cold War. And maybe we should, but I think it ought to be looked at, and that's what I was saying. Another question? Yeah?
Here they come.
Mike is on its way.
Hi, my name is Ari Brown. Question regarding the use of national technical means. So since we don't have access to NTM at this level, how could UAVs fill a niche role with that doesn't unnecessarily duplicate the efforts, like merely operating under the assumption that you have a satellite overhead, it is looking down, and also are these UAVs doing active or passive ISR?
Both active and passive. And the way that they fill the niche is that you're able to do the focused search. Perhaps the overhead asset gives you a general area of interest. Then it can continue to do that sort of sucking up all the data job, and the more maneuverable, more programmable MQ-4 or MQ-9 or MALE UAV then does the focus search and stays on the target and provides that data back through whatever network you have or networks that do that.
Does that not conflict with the no false positive rule you guys have?
I'm not sure what you're talking about. The no false positive rule was just as a way of trying to say that what we are doing in this study is presenting the very best case. What we are saying is, because we're not dealing with false positives, because we're dealing with perfect radar days, that we're giving you the very best ranges and numbers of planes.
Understand, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Time for one more question? Yes.
Hello, my name is Roland Evans, China Channel, and my question's quite simple, really. We've seen back in the 1990s, I was a hydrographic surveyor in the South China Sea off Sanya and off Hainan Island, the pipeline that they've got going up to Hong Kong. And my question is very simple, seeing the land grab that we've had in the South China Sea with China and its island building. And that was going on back then. And my question is, why doesn't the US tow an oil rig in, jack-up rig? It would cause them absolute chaos from a psychological point of view, and just operate 13 Marines off it and a helicopter. And to me, it would tie up and make them spend a fortune of their budget on watching this little outpost in the South China Sea?
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. There's a whole range of things that the United States could do, but is not doing right now. And, you know, that one could certainly be considered. I don't see why not. But to give you, you know, to just expand a little bit on that, the defense of Taiwan is an area where this administration has improved over the record of its predecessor. But it's come this far, but that leaves between here and the other side of the room. We're not doing that. There are all sorts of things that the administration could do if Vice President Pence's suggestion about a whole government approach to our, not just China, but to our alliances and to the security architecture that we have in the West Pacific were made possible. The administration has done some of it, but there's a lot left to be done. So I applaud the progress that's taken place so far, and hope that this administration or whatever ones succeeded now or in the future take the same view of our security interests in that part of the world and act accordingly.
Hello, gentlemen. I'm Tim Tran. I'm also a former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer, so it looks like we're in good company. Your study focused a lot on surface targeting, using aerial assets to target surface vessels, but I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on ISRT in the realm of undersea warfare as well. As we all know, China's nuclear attack submarines have stealth and endurance and attack capability that could really threaten our sea lines of communication in order to keep outposts like Guam or our carrier strike groups well supplied. So I'm curious to see what your recommendations would be for improving the Navy's undersea warfare ISRT.
That's one of the areas where I'm actually really satisfied where things are. And I know it's dangerous for somebody like me to say they're satisfied. The P-8 buy is enormous. We're buying a lot of them. The ANSQR-15, or the ANSQR-89 Victor 15 system, ASW system that we're putting on our ships, turn those ships into significant, long-range, active and passive ASW platforms. I haven't even gotten to the world's best submarine force yet. There is no military skill where the difference between the #1 nation and the #2 nation is larger than subsurface warfare. Our submarine force is just that good. I put those things together with unmanned undersea vessels, unmanned surface vessels that are essentially gliders that then carry acoustic platforms beneath them. We're doing quite a bit to ensure that we maintain that an undersea mastery over China versus their submarines. Now, I think one of the things we have to worry about is the kind of arrogance that I just displayed, and that is ASW or undersea warfare dominance is not a birthright. China's got a lot of engineers that are working really hard to try and figure out how to make the sea less opaque. I know our own submarine force tends to talk as if that'll never happen and that we'll just keep getting better faster than they can understand the environment. I think, though, that that's not a winning strategy for the long haul, and that we have to begin to take their ASW capabilities a little more seriously.
Yeah, we got to go. I saw the proverbial hook coming
We
in
got
my
the hook
direction.
from the guy in the back of the room.
So I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Excellent participation from the audience.
Thank you, David.
And hope that you'll be here the next time we have another one of these discussions. Thank you. And thank our panelists. Everyone else, please.